Hello and welcome to this British Museum event in conversation on women in peace building. My name is Belinda Crerar and I'm the curator of the Citi exhibition Feminine Power, the Divine to the Demonic. And in this exhibition, myself and my colleague Lucy Dalton have been asking provocative questions. How has female authority been perceived in different spiritual traditions around the world? And does this influence our views on femininity? For insights, we've been looking to divine to demonic figures, feared and revered for over 5,000 years, from wisdom, passion and desire to war, justice and mercy. This diverse expression of female spiritual powers across the world prompts us to reflect on how we view femininity and indeed gender identity today. From the worship of Pele, the Hawaiian goddess of volcanoes, which reveals her destructive capacity, also venerated alongside an ability to create, to the Buddhist bodhisattva of compassion who transcends gender and is visualized in male form in Tibetan art, but female form in Chinese and Japanese art, which uncovers the importance of gender fluidity in some spiritual traditions. To the terrifying goddess Kali, depicted in art carrying a severed head and bloodied sword, who is honored as the great mother and liberator from fear and ignorance. The exhibition has been enhanced by engagement with faith communities, contemporary worshippers, and also by insights provided by 5 high-profile commentators, Rabia Siddique, who is here with us tonight, Bonnie Greer, Mary Beard, Elizabeth Day, and Deborah Francis White, who have engaged with the subject of the exhibition and shared their own responses from their professional and lived experiences about what all of this means to them. So, with us now, discussing aspects of feminine power today, we are welcoming our 2 outstanding speakers. On my left is Rabia Siddique, a former British Army officer, human rights advocate, multi-award-winning storyteller and barrister, specializing in war crimes, terrorism, and human rights. Overcoming a terrifying hostage ordeal and childhood sexual abuse, Rabia has garnered global attention for standing up for justice in the face of public ridicule. In successfully suing the British government for silencing her about her 2005 hostage ordeal, it opened the floodgates for similar cases, heralding policy changes to deliver a fairer workplace for women and cultural minorities in the military and other areas of public life. Author of the best-selling memoir, Equal Justice, My Journey as a Woman, a Soldier and a Muslim, Rabia has been decorated by Queen Elizabeth II for her humanitarian work in Asia, South America, Europe and the Middle East. Her greatest joy, being a mother to her triplet sons, amplifies her drive to advocate for the most marginalized communities and show how value-based leadership can foster peace, inclusion, diversity, equality and the sustainability of our planet. On my right is Alice Walpole, former United Nations Assistant Secretary General, who was appointed Director of Good Enough College in April 2021. Good Enough College is an educational charity that provides a stimulating and supportive residential community for over 700 outstanding international postgraduate scholars studying in London. Prior to her UN role, Ms. Walpole enjoyed a long and distinguished career with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Her most recent assignment was as Deputy Special Representative of the UN Secretary General in the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, based in Baghdad, an appointment she held from 2017 to 2021. Previously, during her diplomatic career, she served as British Ambassador to Mali and Niger, as well as British Ambassador to Luxembourg and British Consul General in Basra, Iraq. She also served in various capacities in London, New York, in Brussels, and in Dar es Salaam. She was awarded OBE in 2017 New Year's Honours for services to British diplomacy. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So, I'd like to begin our conversation today by asking, do women make better peacemakers? Rabia.
So I guess when answering this question, I can only bring my lived experience as a human rights practitioner and as a former soldier and I guess with my life journey. When I look back on the last 30 years of my career, much of which has been in conflict zones, in countries with political instability, abject poverty, and largely in quite patriarchal societies and male-dominated environments. I think I've come to some realizations that women bring multifaceted qualities and a more nuanced approach to peacemaking, to mediation, to negotiations, which when I have witnessed, which has been rare because it's been predominantly men that have been seated at those tables, but when women who bring that diversity and that nuanced approach to these settings, the common ground seems to be found a lot earlier. The approach seems to be different because there is a greater emphasis, and of course I'm generalising, so that my comments come with a caveat that these are sort of generalisations and blanket statements, and there's always exceptions, of course. But women in positions of influence that are mediating and negotiating where the stakes are high come from a place of consensus, collaboration, rather than being driven by ego and power. And that's sort of how I have noticed things play out in the different settings that I've been involved in. And I think you can say that, or certainly I would say that, of high stakes, international and domestic conflict and post-conflict situations, but also that similarly applies to a number of other contexts, domestic, community, workplaces, and I think there's some common themes. And for me, that's been something that I've learned from my involvement in the exhibition as well, that when a woman can embrace her femininity and her nurturing and her life-making essence, but balance that and also bring fierceness and perseverance and resilience and focus, the combination of all of those qualities result in very effectual peace building.
Alice.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I suppose I'm not so certain that I would be so bold to identify it as feminine, but certainly the skill sets that I've seen brought to the negotiating table. For me, the absolute number one skill set, and one that I've tried to deploy, is around listening. It's around helping people to articulate what it is that they want to, the outcomes that they're looking for. And quite often in negotiations, people have a very unclear idea of the outcomes. So there's a huge value around listening. It's that old adage, you have one mouth and two ears and use them proportionally. And I have been I've been mediating between communities where somebody has held the floor for 2 hours. When I was in Iraq, some community leaders wished to start off with a history of their community. Sometimes they started in the Ottoman Empire, and sometimes they went back about 3,000 years, And people speak for a long time, and you must listen. It's the listening is where you're adding value. And I think often that's a trait that the women I have worked with have shown the sort of active, proactive, empathetic listening that comes to, I think, a lot of women. I've learnt it as a mother, has come to, is extremely valuable. And I think there's also, often in the search for a solution, it's very important that those who participate step outside themselves and become part of a community that's searching for a solution. And again, in a lot of the patriarchal societies in which I've been seeking a solution, it's been very difficult to get some of the key figures, always male, to let go of their sense of status and authority. So I think I'm starting with where are the skill sets in peace building and finding solutions. And I've seen those skill sets manifested very often by women, where they've got in through the door, or they've been. I've been in a very privileged position because I was representing the United Nations, But as you say, women are very rarely, they are rigorously excluded from most political processes, or they're allowed in a very small way. I remember after elections in Iraq having a conversation with a very senior male political figure, and Iraq has so many wonderfully competent, talented women in their society, and they really need them. They need them in their search for long-term sustainability. And I remember saying to this male politician how very dismayed I was that they had selected almost the whole of the Iraqi cabinet, and so far not a single woman. And he said to me, "But we don't have a ministry for women." So in his mind, the role for a woman in a senior political role
was
would
one
only
portfolio.
be if she were, it's just the one portfolio.
Yeah.
And that's a view that was manifested again and again in negotiations. And we pushed very hard in all of the negotiations I've been involved in. It's about absolutely demanding that there are representatives of all the community in the room. And 50% of every community is female. And so everybody coming to the table should have not token women in their delegation, but women who represent their community.
It's interesting that you say that we don't have a ministry for women. The only reason for a woman to be in that position would be to look after women's affairs. I think that's something that comes up in the exhibition at the moment. We're looking at all of these representations of powerful divine womanhood or femininity, as it may be. But we have to always understand that these spiritual forces are not only important for women, they're not only venerated by women, and they're not only related to concerns that impact women, they're honoured by everyone, and they're important in issues that affect everyone. Sometimes those issues which have traditionally been framed as male occupations, when we think of goddesses like Athena. And in the ancient Greek world, she presided over politics and the military and justice and courts and all institutions from which women themselves were actively excluded. So how do you think we break down that barrier, that sort of assumption that if it's this women's issues are only important for women, or women who want to get involved in these sort of traditionally male areas of public life, would only be coming at it from the view or the perspective of what's important for women? How do you think we overcome that mentality?
I mean, I think one of the challenges in many societies is there's such a strong consciousness of women as women. And one of the hugely liberating factors for me in every job that I have had in societies like that was that I wasn't coming in as a woman. I was coming in as Her Majesty's Consul General or the UN Assistant Secretary General, so I had a status that sort of made my femininity irrelevant. People had a respect for me as a woman, and of course in a lot of the societies in which I've engaged, there's a tremendous respect for women. There was a particular respect for me. I have lots of children. That brought me respect. I'm quite old. That brought me respect. So there was respect for me. But paradoxically, the key was to be there, not as a woman at all, but as the figure that I was and what I represented. And I think often for women, it's very important to establish what your status is and then carry that before you. We were talking, Rabia and I were talking about this yesterday. When I was first an ambassador, I very much encouraged my staff to call me ambassador in front of other people. It was part of establishing my status. When there weren't other people there, they called me Alice, but it's lots of little things like that. And again, when I engaged with women in negotiations, or people from minority communities or younger people, for example, I afford them almost an exaggerated respect for their professionalism and their status. They're there in that room because of what they know, or because of who they represent, or because of the ideas they've had. And I think it's enormously important to show respect to that. And I think that's how we help people carry a bit more weight. How in the past I've tried to help more junior members of my staff by giving a sort of formality to their job title, by treating them with very clear respect. And I think it is that. It's taking away the assumptions that people have when they look at someone, and replacing that with something that is around the sort of dignity of their position. I think that's very important.
Absolutely, and it's somewhat heartening to hear that you feel that you have been afforded that same treatment yourself. When you walk into a room, you're seen as the ambassador and not a woman. Rabia, have you had similar experiences?
It's interesting. I want to pick up on that word respect that Alice was just mentioning, and reflecting on that and my journey. One of the scenarios that keeps coming back to me as I'm listening to Alice relating her experience is also in Iraq, a different situation where one of the areas of work that I was involved with when I was still in the military was working closely with the Iraqi legal and judicial authorities, and also working with Iraqi people. And you were speaking about listening. Stephen Covey, the famous leader who spoke about and wrote a lot about the 7 habits of highly effective people, one of the 7 habits of leadership, or one of the traits of good leadership, was seek first to understand before one seeks to be understood. And that's a lesson that I've carried with me through my leadership journey, that importance. And it's not just about active listening, but it is about respect, and it's about humility. Who am I to be speaking when I am trying to serve and advocate for a community, when I'm an outsider? My first job is to listen and to understand. And in that process of showing and giving respect and demonstrating humility, one gains respect and earns respect and establishes authority. And that all happens in the unspoken with actions. And that's what I have found in my journey. And I think the example that best brings that to life for me that I can share is I was representing a group of Sunni men, 37 Sunni men, who were the victims of some of the most abhorrent human rights abuses. And I was advocating for them in what became a class action. And it was quite a historical case. We had to go up to Baghdad and meet several times with the Chief Justice up there and convince him to do something that hadn't really been done before, which was to accept anonymous evidence from these men who were petrified of travelling up to Baghdad and giving evidence in person for fear of recrimination. I think we and I, as sort of the leader of the legal team representing them, was only able to build rapport and trust and respect because of the time that I invested in listening. But it wasn't just that. It was being at the level of maturity on my life journey where I had come to embrace my feminine qualities as well, and allow myself to feel and show emotion and embrace my femininity. And in doing that, in showing emotion as they were recounting to me the horrific experiences that they had been through, it somehow gave them permission to feel and to be vulnerable and to be honest. And I think in a lot of those cases, when I think back on those men, it's the first time that they had related, that they had fully recounted what had happened to them. And I wonder, when I reflect on that, whether that would have happened and we would have been able to successfully get their cases to the Central Criminal Court had there been someone else, and dare I say, perhaps a man in charge of that. So it's that whole, Brené Brown talks about the power of vulnerability. And I think when using that in an authentic way, we give permission for others to embrace their feminine and masculine and their whole human self. And I think there's great value in that.
So do you feel that, both of you have worked in parts of the world which are extremely patriarchal. I imagine most of your negotiating experience has been with men, do you actually feel like there is an advantage to being a woman coming into those situations? Is that...
In some cases, I think the expectation of me has been very low. There I am, I've turned up. I mean, interestingly, I talked a little bit about sort of status. You know, you're dressing quite formally, you're asking your staff to move around you in a way that makes it clear that you are the person, at the, spearheading this activity. But every now and then, you want to do something quite different and kind of underplay everything. And I've had, I'm older, and I've been in to speak to militia leaders in a very relaxed way, and they're almost treating, I'm probably the age of their mother, and they're treating me a little bit, but with the respect that you would give to a mother.
Yes.
And they expect me to be a little bit motherly. Maternal, but actually, I'm there to negotiate something quite serious, whether it's about access or whether it's about treatment of communities. And that's that can be quite useful. And then in very formal societies, some very formal societies where people would be very concerned about being rude to a woman. So I've had people just shout me down, but in other meetings I've had people who have listened to me because actually I'm an older woman, and they would feel awful at sort of speaking over me. So I think it depends enormously on the circumstances, but I do think that for quite a lot of one negotiation in which I was involved in a very divided community in Iraq, divided between Turkmen and Arab and Kurdish communities, who wouldn't speak to each other. They started off individually as communities speaking to me because I think I was completely unthreatening. And I think, one of the things I've noticed is people quite often, when they're talking to me, start off with asking me sort of almost domestic questions that they wouldn't start by asking a male colleague of mine. But that's good. If that's the way that makes them feel comfortable with me, then I'm absolutely fine about that. And certainly when I was a young diplomat in Tanzania, traveling around the country, traveling to communities that are quite wary of authority, and we would turn up in the car, and I was still feeding one of my daughters who was a baby at the time. And you hop out of the car and you sit down under a tree and you feed your baby, and that is completely unthreatening. But it's also a universal female activity, and people come out to talk to you because you're not another at all. You're just another woman feeding her baby. And I'm afraid obviously I had to feed her regularly anyway, but I shamelessly exploited that because, you sit down and people who would not perhaps come up to a car full of, strange white diplomats will come up and talk to a woman about...
Sort of disarming, isn't it?
It is disarming. Yeah. And they come up and, the first question is this baby sleeping all night yet? And I think that is, that's a tremendous way of reaching out. And because in the domestic sphere, there are all sorts of things that are completely familiar to everybody, wherever they live and whatever their background is. There's a lot that is replicated in the domestic sphere, and if that's the way to get to people, by showing that you're very like them, then bringing all the experiences you have from the domestic sphere into the public sphere can actually be quite valuable.
Well, I was going to ask, because you're both mothers, Rabia, you have 3 sons, Alice, you have 6 children. Do you think that experience has honed your negotiating skills?
We were talking about multitasking.
I was saying at one stage I had 3 children, I had 6 children more or less who were teenagers.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. My negotiating skills
Good grief.
My negotiating skills were honed there. But I mean, 3 at once, my goodness, that's a 3-pronged attack.
Well, that's where the military training came in handy, because it was a military operation. Do you know, it's interesting you asked that question, because I look at how I approached negotiation and my work pre-children and post-children. And I think the difference that I can see is there was more of a roundedness and a softness and a zoom out approach, and probably a lot more of a mature perspective when I look at my work and how I approached it after becoming a parent, because one's perspective changes. And so when I was in Iraq, I wasn't a parent, and I think I had a very, very focused, almost black and white approach to my humanitarian work. Mm-hmm. And then when one becomes a parent and you sort of, get knocked about and challenged, and it's very grounding, you make room for the shades of grey. And so when I think back to a couple of years ago, representing and advocating for the families of the victims of the Christchurch mosque attacks, and I think about how I approached that, listening and respect was still so important, but I was speaking to mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, it makes me emotional now still, who had lost their loved ones in the most appalling circumstances. And I think being able to bring just enough of that humanity and that lived experience as a parent, and sometimes it's not even what you say, it's just the way you approach it, or that natural human response and empathy that you feel because one puts oneself in their shoes and thinking about how you go on after losing your child in such horrific circumstances. I think that makes a huge amount of difference, not in terms of just building trust and respect, but in terms of how one advocates, and the heart that you bring, not just the head and the facts and the training, but when you bring that element of heart and you allow yourself to bring your human self to your work, I think for me that's made a significant difference, not just in the meaning of the work, but the way that I have been able to advocate for people who I'm serving, whose duty, my duty is to be the best possible advocate for them. So yeah, I've definitely seen a difference.
Have you noticed a change in your approach?
I agree. Look, I had my children young, so I'd only been in the Foreign Office a couple of years. So I've had children throughout so Parenthood has coloured the whole of my diplomatic career. I do remember, and of course it was much rarer in the early 1990s to be a parent. In quite a lot of the fora in which I was working, and women were much rarer. And at that time, I think women were making huge steps forward in the corporate and public sphere, but not doing very much in divesting themselves of all those domestic, the domestic sphere. So I remember being in meetings where my Portuguese colleague and I, who were both female, and this was when I was at the EU in Brussels, she and I would be writing out little lists of things to do, or shopping lists, or whatever, while the meeting went on around
multitasking.
Absolutely, multitasking. And actually, what made me laugh was sometimes, European councils can go on all night. If you've had twins who never sleep at the same time, you learn to function on very, very few hours sleep. Yeah. And a completely sleepless night, hey, you've done that before. And it was so funny to look at some of the big councils that went on, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, the negotiations would still be going on. The people who were still sitting upright in their seats, on the whole, were the parents.
Yeah.
They could do, a sleepless night like that. So it used to make me laugh. There's a lot that's very, there's a lot of very serious stuff that you bring to the table if you've been a parent. But my goodness, you bring a resilience and a flexibility as well that I think serves women, and increasingly men who are parents.
Yes.
Because of course nowadays I look at my brothers and my sons-in-law, and it's they're full on parenting as well. They're learning all these skill sets.
Yeah.
Now, as it is more expected that men will have a more hands-on role in raising children, are you seeing changes from your experience? Have there been differences in the way that women and men approach negotiations, and is that changing as these sort of cultural norms change as well?
I suspect that we've both worked in environments where people who do a great deal of parenting are not, we're in environments where people don't do a great deal of parenting. We're in environments with people who spend long periods of time away from their families. the role I had at the UN, I was only able to take it up because my last two children had headed off to university. I'm quite sure there will be lots. I mean, I think I look at, my kids are a mix of millennials and Gen Z, and their approach to life is wholly different from that of many of the people I was working with sort of 30 years ago. And qualities like empathy and understanding and respect are enormously important for for my kids' generations, so I think these skill sets are being brought to the table much more now than they were in the past. And I think as societies, we are of course questioning issues around status and sort of. I mean, we've talked about working in highly patriarchal societies, Iraq, where women are rigorously excluded from the political process. But it's. I think other societies, other societies are growing and changing in completely different ways and functioning in completely different ways. I think we're all of us questioning now some of the structures that were absolutely taken for granted in the past, and all for the better. As much, I'm very pleased at these changes. But I think young diplomats coming up now, young members of the military, certainly the young people I've engaged with in all of the countries I've been living in recently, are so much more open to understanding the experiences of others and so much more respectful and humble about other people's experience. I think the world is changing very quickly. And what I'm keen to do, what I love about the internet is that even the people sitting in societies that haven't made these huge changes, the young people know what's going on elsewhere in the world. It's extraordinary to see, I spent quite a lot of time in Iran over the last 4 years, and young Iranians are so fantastically plugged into what's happening all over the world. It's really interesting to engage with them, and yet theirs is in many ways quite a closed society. So I think there's huge changes come.
Yes, it's becoming increasingly difficult to have a closed society. With internet access and globalization.
And I think your question does have a cultural context to it. For the last 10 years I've moved away from pure law, and a lot of my work now is around values-based leadership and equity and diversity and resilience. And when I think of the young leaders of tomorrow, young men and women and boys and girls that I work with, certainly in Western culture there is this growing equity and expectation of equity in workplaces, in relationships, in the home. And I think one of the things that is going in parallel, that is sort of developing in parallel with that, is this challenging of binary gender stereotypes, which is wonderful. But it's interesting to see in certain countries like Afghanistan, where the young have had a taste of democracy and of greater equality, and then having to go back, particularly young girls and women going back to a very closed, patriarchal, controlling, oppressive existence. That's where I have concern, and that's where, of course, being an optimist, one always has hope. But when you see what's going on in the world, it is largely this younger generation of people-led change movement. And I think that's where, for me, the hope lies. Even the young people that find themselves in very challenging circumstances in parts of the world where, having had a taste of democracy and freedom and equality, and then being sort of shut down again, I think that will be temporary. I'd like to think that that's transient, and actually people power will win out in the end, because that's my hope for the next generation, really. That's why we do what we do to a large extent. But when you look at the Me Too movement, for example, which is one of these people-led movements that I think about that we've all been exposed to in the last few years. So many important things have come out of that in terms of empowerment and challenging perspectives and behaviours and norms. And for me, what's really interesting, and Mary Beard talks about this, is where we're heading to now, which is women finding their voice and seeking their own justice and sharing their stories for change. But now when we speak about listening, the conversations we're having increasingly now is about, and now the work to be done is listening to the male narrative and listening to the stories that these men tell themselves in order to excuse, justify, or defend behaviour. And we must listen. So it's that choice about knowing when to speak up and knowing when to listen, or knowing when to stand up and knowing when to sit down. It is so important that we listen, because it's only when we listen to the other narrative that we can truly understand some of the root causes of some of these cultural problems that we need to address in order to change things long term, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And it just got me thinking, I mean, there must have been times in both of your careers where you have been in negotiations and come up against a wall, and for all of your listening, have you ever had to change tact and be more aggressive and be more forceful?
Yeah.
Rabia?
I'd say both of us,
Yes.
number of times,
Yeah.
in negotiations and in
Yeah.
court.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's knowing where, and I think this is what we were saying before about the nuanced approach, knowing when to put the foot down on the accelerator, and knowing when you need to take it up a notch, and knowing when greater intensity and, dare I say, not just robust approach, but where sometimes aggression is needed. And when we look at some of the deities that are involved in the exhibition, this multifaceted life giver, life taker, fierce and maternal, and being able to harness and be discerning when you deploy those different approaches, definitely. But not only that, there's been times, and I'm sure with you, Alice, as well, where I've also had to admit defeat and walk away.
Yes. No, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And again, that's something that is, it's often very nuanced, and it's one of the I look back at someone said to me the other day, what was your biggest failure when you were in Iraq? And you tend not to look at failures, but when the young Yazidi and Turkmen women who were sold into slavery by Islamic State came back to Iraq, it was very difficult for their communities to accept them back because of what had happened to them. And some of their religious leaders were quite doubtful about whether their return into the community would damage their community. And communities like the Yazidi community are quite small communities already. And there was a huge amount of discussion about how this could be, what the future role of these young women would be. And they were accepted back into their community, most of them, and that felt like a huge success. But a number of them had had children while they were enslaved, and the community felt that it couldn't take back their children. They weren't Yazidi; they were half Muslim. In fact, they were Muslim from their fathers, which is what counted. And we were being very strongly encouraged. I was being very strongly encouraged for very good reasons by people in New York that we should keep pressing for the children to be accepted with their mothers into the community. And I could see, and I understood from the conversations that we were having with people from all of the communities, that really wasn't going to be possible, that these children weren't going to go back into that community. And then we had to think about what other options were available for the children, or what options were available for the young women who decided that they wanted to stay with their children more than they wanted to stay with their community. Was there a possibility for them to do that? But I could see that wasn't going to work, and it was a terribly difficult thing to, partly because I am a parent, and everyone can empathise with these poor young women, but That was very difficult. That was a failure. The children went into orphanages, and many of them ended up with lovely, loving foster and adoptive families. But that was a terrible disappointment for me, and it took me a long time to get over it.
Yeah. So, I suppose that makes you think. I mean, that sounds like such a tragic situation to be in. That it, just sort of reminds me that your job is not just political. You are dealing with spiritual traditions as well, and many spiritual traditions have traditionally not held female identity or femininity in as high a regard as male, and that sounds like an example where that was made very clear. To what extent does this come up a lot in your work of having to navigate beliefs, spiritual beliefs,
and all the time? I mean, outside parts of Western Europe, many communities are profoundly religious, not just spiritual, but profoundly, and many communities live their lives entirely according to their religious beliefs, and those those override everything else. And you're an absolute idiot if you don't take that into account. And I have a tremendous respect for people's religious beliefs, and they always have to be factored in. Anything that steers and guides a community needs to be factored in. And I became very used to people asking me about my religious beliefs as well. That became, for a lot of them, a very important part of understanding me and where I came from, because in those communities. And it's interesting because, of course, one of the things we're often trying to break down, where much of the conflict arises actually or ostensibly through religious differences. That's what you've got to tackle. You're tackling people's religious differences as a way of getting towards a solution. And if you don't understand and respect the religions that are involved in this conflict, then you will never get to the solution.
Yeah.
But it's overwhelmingly important.
Absolutely agree with you. And it's interesting when I think of, conversely, working in those environments, predominantly in Muslim countries and with Muslim communities, with very religious people, it had an impact on me. As a child of migrant parents growing up in Australia, in the time that I grew up, and the political climate in Australia, as migrants, we were very much encouraged to check our differences at the door and to assimilate and to blend and to fly beneath the radar. So I spent a huge part of my life denying and ignoring my Muslim heritage in order to fit in. And really for me, it wasn't until my work took me to and amongst many Muslim communities and religious communities that I was able to embrace and value and understand my Muslim heritage and take it back and I guess incorporate it into my life in the way that made me comfortable, but to sort of retake that part of my identity when you actually then make the time. And I think this is the case for all religions, because it's not the religions that divide us, it's the interpretation and the power and the land and the way religion is abused in the name of power and divide. But when you look at a lot of the religions and you take the time to understand them, there is so much love and understanding and acceptance and unity involved in all of the teachings. And that's been an incredible blessing for me, to gain a better understanding and to, as I have become older and now in my 50s, to be able to unapologetically embrace my spiritualism. Not so much my religiousness, because I wouldn't call myself religious, but to embrace and to bring to my work my spirituality and to trust in that as a skill and an attribute, but to also trust in that as part of my compass and moral compass. And I think when we speak about women and ask ourselves the question, do we make better peacemakers? I believe, and this is probably a bit of a provocative thing to say, that one of the things we are equipped with as women is this intuition, that when honed and when we trust, can actually be a huge and useful tool in life, never mind in negotiations.
And do you think that is something that women have more of? I know it's a bit of an adage that women have more sort of intuition, is it?
That's a generalisation.
Do you think there's any truth?
Generally, I do. Generally, I do. There are very enlightened and aware men, of course, that are connected to their spiritual.
I mean, based on your experience, you're
based
working
on
in the
my
field,
lived journey.
Yes,
you've
seen.
I do.
No, you know, I've met a lot of extremely intuitive people, and some were male and some were female. I've met people who were good listeners, and some were male and some were female. I do think that quite a few of the attributes that we have been talking about are generally found more among women and honed among women, because these are the things that we are partly expected to do, but some of the things that, I mean, as we were talking about things like parenthood, move us in this direction. So I think, you know, I'm sort of wary about putting people in boxes and saying women do this or men do this, or
very much.
But I am, you know, I am conscious that that the fact that you know, my outlook on the world and the way it's informed by the experiences I have had, have enabled me to function throughout my career in ways that have been different and sometimes very successful, sometimes not so much successful, but in ways that have been different from my male colleagues. And you know, don't forget, when I joined the Foreign Office, there were relatively few women in the Foreign Office, because until a decade before I joined, women had to resign from the office when they got married. So
not that long ago.
Not that long ago. And so at the time, you know, there were very, very few women up ahead of us in the Foreign Office, and I mean, I have to say, it was a very good employer, because the Foreign Office had been in the business of sending families out, whole families out all over the world for hundreds of years. And we all knew each other's families. We were working in offices, and we knew lots of colleagues, and we'd done a posting overseas with them, so we'd lived next door to them. And the office was, but it was, you know, it was a very male environment, with those of us going through and testing the boundaries. And what was good was that the Foreign Office was full of eminently sensible people, and when I found something that I thought was completely wrong, I was able to claim babysitting costs back if I was at a reception, but I wasn't if I was in the office at 10 at night. You know, every time we turned around and said, hang on, this isn't right, someone more senior would say, no, you're right, it's absolute rubbish, let's fix it. All sorts of things got fixed as we move forward. And it enriched the office. Foreign Office became a much broader and more diverse community to its own benefit.
I mean, that sounds very reassuring, that diversification in institutions like that is having a benefit in changing attitudes across those institutions. Yeah. Rabia, from your experience, do you see this happening in the military?
Well, I've been out of the military for quite some time now, and I think it's a different institution. I don't think one can necessarily say, like the Foreign Office, that it was the original family-friendly employer. But you know, the business of the military is very different, and it's heavily operation-based, which requires discipline and training and a level of sort of divorcing oneself from domestic life in order to focus and execute the mission. So I think that there are operational realities of the military as an institution and the function that it provides that will always make that a bit challenging. What has been interesting that I have tracked both in the UK since my time and in Australia, where I now once again call home, is this growth and this sort of slow transformation of the role of women in the military, on the front line as first responders. And I think that has changed and evolved, where women have stepped up and proven themselves to be equal in terms of what one would traditionally define as masculine physical strength, but also as operators and as practitioners. So I think there has been some change, but I think culturally it's like turning a juggernaut around. I think there is change. I think that the authorities understand that there is an imperative to change, and things are moving in the right direction. Certainly policies and regulations have changed, which drive attitudes and culture, but culture is the thing that comes last. And sometimes that's generational.
I mean, things are changing because in countries like the UK, women are represented, very well represented at the top of institutions. Yes. And, we're in charge and we can change the institutions.
And there's
a whole other story, of course, about women who don't help other women further down the chain. But certainly a lot of the institutions that I've engaged with, women are in significant numbers at the top. Yeah. And interestingly, of course, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he came in his first term as Secretary General, he took a decision that I think he told us it would be 703 years for women to move up significantly and be represented at 50% at every level if we went on as we were going on at the time back in 2017. So he decided that he would simply fill all senior jobs with women until we'd got somewhere near parity. And that's exactly what he did. And the UN Secretariat now at senior levels is an absolute model of gender parity. But you do sometimes have to do something quite drastic to move that forward. And what is particularly lovely is that the women at the top of the UN, it's not just that there are lots more women now, but that the women themselves are much more diverse, coming from all different parts of the world, all sorts of different backgrounds, bringing completely different experience. We're much more diverse than the senior men at the UN, who are rather more similar to each other. So that's been very interesting. It was very interesting for me because, of course, I was lucky enough to come into the UN on that wave of enthusiasm for far more women at senior levels, and it was a delight to find myself in an institution with so many women at the senior level. We had a wonderful weekend away for the senior women at Under Secretary General and Assistant Secretary General level, and there was such a burst of enthusiasm and ideas and excitement about this institution that we were helping to run. It was really exciting to see it.
It's interesting listening to you speak, because I think that's the key, isn't it? When we speak about change and we speak about shifting the dial, it really does require women, and if we're talking about diversity in its broader sense, more diversity at the decision-making table, in those key influencing positions. Women and people from other cultures, so disabled, abled, men and women, ethnic minorities. All of that diversity of thought and experience and approach is really what's needed. And when we speak about, peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping, and when you look at what's going on in the world, where there is so much grief and division and conflict, when the people in the positions of power are almost without exception men, I can't help thinking and asking myself, if there were more women, if there was more diversity at those highest levels of office, could we prevent, and could there be less conflict and division in this world? And I'm convinced the answer to that more and more is yes. So let's hope that that's not too far away.
And so what do you think we need to do to keep up this momentum for change, to bring more diversity into these institutions?
I mean, I think we're on the trajectory anyway, because demographics are changing and people are changing and the world is changing, and we were talking about a much more outward-looking young generation who, you know, and interestingly, you know, in Iraq, talking to young people the same age as my kids, I mean, astonishingly similar to my own kids, living utterly different lives in a completely different environment, and yet many of the values, many of the ideas, much of the music they're listening to, many, you know, very similar to my own kids, and the world is changing in that way. It's impossible to stop the flow of ideas. So I think it's about helping that along. I think it's about promoting openness to other people and other ideas. It's about listening. It's about tolerance. It's about respect. I do have concerns about some of the public dialogue. At both at global and national level here in the UK. I'm seeing quite a lot of intolerance and lack of respect, quite a lot of bullying, quite a lot of judging. All of those are things that I've seen in societies that were falling apart. So those things do concern me. But overall, I think I'm an optimist anyway. I wouldn't have 6 kids if I wasn't an optimist. But we were generally, you know, the world was moving in the right direction. But I think, you know, we can encourage it by encouraging people to be outward and open and enthusiastic and interested in the lives and views of others, but particularly interested in the views of people who think differently from us.
Absolutely.
And for example, I'm always very interested in the fact that people are very proud of their tolerance of other religions. People are very proud of the fact that they have friends from other religious backgrounds. Of course they are, it's a good thing. They're much less tolerant of people who come from other political backgrounds and have different political views. I don't have any respect for people at the extreme ends of either the political or the religious spectrums. But there's a lot in the middle there. And actually, I have friends with very different political views from me, and I'm very comfortable with that. I think that's interesting in the same way that religious diversity is interesting. There's a lot less tolerance around differing political views. And so I'm a big fan of tolerance and expanding our acceptance of what's on the spectrum. I'm nowhere, you know, not going anywhere near the extremes, but
even at the extremes, do you think that it is worth engaging with the extremes in conversation to, you know,
I think
that
there is
a way
an obligation to listen to understand where they're
very
coming
often.
from.
I mean, it's difficult sometimes because there are extreme views which I don't think deserve.
It must be a very difficult balance as a negotiator.
Well, it's that whole,
I think
I don't agree with what you're saying, but I will fight till the
contact.
end for your freedom to say it.
Yeah.
It's that sort of
No,
conundrum.
I think that is very. I mean, I think that's very important, and it's very important to engage with other ideas. I mean, I used to say to my children, you know, somebody who thinks differently from you, it doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong.
No.
There's not a right and a wrong.
Yes.
There's often a right and a right.
Yes, that's what I say to my kids.
and
It's not
often
better, it's not worse, it's just different.
It's different, and people who think differently from you, not only are they not necessarily wrong, but they're not necessarily bad.
Yeah,
You know? We can encompass that. You can respect someone else's views without, and again, you know, you come back to negotiations. Very often in a negotiation, it is so important that you don't end up with win-lose. You end up with win-win.
Yes.
Win of one sort and win of another sort. And that very binary, somebody wins and somebody dominates and somebody, I mean, those come out of, you know, a long patriarchal tradition. Absolutely. That to win, someone else has to be seen to lose.
Right.
Yes.
And actually,
as
if you're
opposed to
changing the
mutual
narrative,
beneficial. Yeah.
So I think that's important. Everybody can benefit from outcomes.
So true.
However different they are.
I think if COVID has taught us anything, and when we speak about how do we build on this momentum, I think it's connectivity. I think it's connection. And I think it's moving away from nationalism and being insular and being individualistic. And I think it's about encouraging and feeding connection you know, whether you call it globalisation, whether it's through social media and the internet. I think connection will continue to unite people, particularly with the younger generation, will continue to unite them. That's how we share stories that impact change. And I think in terms of this movement for greater equity and greater diversity, the more that we connect, the more that we can embrace difference and stop othering, I think that's where we will continue to move in the right direction.
Well, that's sort of what we're trying to do with the exhibition,
Absolutely.
I suppose, by bringing all of these different ideas from different cultures, living cultures around the world today, but also re-examining ideas from the past and putting them together. What I think one of the biggest impressions it's made on me while working on this project is really making me question and challenge my own preconceptions and these ideas that I grew up with, and starting to question, where do they come from? And is there a different way of thinking about things? So thank you both so much for joining us and for such a wonderful conversation.
It's been a delight.
The exhibition is on until the 25th of September, and then it will be opening at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra in December, and then onwards to a 5-venue tour of Spain.